Imagine the worst-case scenario. The electromagnetic pulse hit on a Tuesday morning in October, and within 48 hours, every refrigerator, every freezer, every climate-controlled warehouse in North America became nothing more than an insulated tomb for rotting food. And Carlos Mendez, a 35-year-old former Army logistics officer who spent his last decade teaching wilderness survival to corporate executives, stands in the ruins of a suburban supermarket watching a young mother named Sarah sob over her 4-year-old son's birthday cake, melting into a puddle of bacteria-laden cream in the 90-degree heat that's built up inside the powerless store. And he knows with absolute certainty that in 72 hours, maybe less, the food poisoning will start killing people faster than the violence, faster than the dehydration, faster than anything except maybe the desperation. The rows of frozen dinners, the cases of meat, the walls of dairy products, 2 trillion calories worth of food that could feed millions, are transforming into lethal poison, while panic survivors fill their carts with packages that feel cold but haven't been cold for days. Packages that will hospitalize them, kill their children, because nobody taught them that room temperature meat in an unpowered freezer is a biological weapon after the first 6 hours. Carlos sees a man loading his trunk with what used to be ice cream. Another woman fighting over the last packages of ground beef that's already turned grey-brown. A teenage boy stuffing his backpack with chicken breasts that smell wrong even from 15 feet away, and every single one of them is making a catastrophic mistake that will end in agony, in cholera, in death, that could have been prevented with knowledge that seems obvious now, but wasn't obvious enough to save his own brother Miguel. 2 days ago, when Miguel ate that leftover pasta from the fridge and spent his final hours in convulsions that Carlos still hears in his nightmares. The thermometer on Carlos's belt clip reads 87 degrees Fahrenheit inside this store, and he knows that in this temperature, salmonella doubles every 20 minutes E. E. coli every hour, Clostridium botulinum, producing its deadly toxin in sealed containers that survivors think are safe because they're still vacuum-packed, still look fine, still smell almost normal until you open them and unleash death. Sarah is still crying, still holding that cake, and Carlos makes a decision that will save her life and change his forever. He starts teaching, right there in the ruins, about the ancient preservation methods that humanity used for 10,000 years before refrigeration, the techniques that will determine who lives and who dies in this new world, where your food stockpile will rot faster than you expect. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light from this survivor's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you're listening to me. This is the story of Carlos Mendez, a 35-year-old former Army logistics officer who specialized in supply chain management and wilderness survival training, who spent the first week after the electromagnetic pulse trying to save his extended family in Phoenix, only to watch helplessness as food poisoning claimed his brother, his uncle, and nearly took his niece before he learned the hard lessons that would define his survival mission. With his background in both military provisioning and primitive survival techniques, Carlos became something the shattered remains of his community desperately needed. A teacher, a guide, someone who understood that in this new world without electricity, without refrigeration, without the industrial food system that had fed billions, the knowledge of food preservation wasn't just useful. It was the difference between civilization and extinction. In the scorching heat of the American Southwest, where temperatures routinely exceeded 90 degrees and where the collapse happened at the worst possible time of year, Carlos began moving through survivor camps, teaching anyone who would listen about salt curing, smoke preservation, fermentation, and the dozens of other techniques that could transform perishable food into stable nutrition. But knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. Not when grief and guilt drove him forward, not when every person he saved felt like inadequate penance for the ones he'd lost, not when he discovered that survival wasn't just about keeping yourself alive, but about finding purpose in keeping others alive too. The disaster that had ended the world began with a coordinated high-altitude nuclear detonation that created an electromagnetic pulse spanning the entire continent, destroying every electronic device, every power grid, every computer system in a single blinding instant that humanity's infrastructure had never been designed to survive. Carlos had been teaching a weekend survival course in the Superstition Mountains when the flash lit up the sky, when every phone died simultaneously, when the world went silent in a way that made his military training kick in with terrible certainty about what had just happened. The drive back to Phoenix took 14 hours instead of 2. His truck one of the few older vehicles without computerized systems, and what he found in the city changed him in ways he was still processing 3 weeks later. The supermarket incident with Sarah and her son came on day 16, when Carlos had finally accepted that his brother was gone, when he'd finally stopped blaming himself for not teaching Miguel these lessons years earlier, when he'd finally understood that the only way forward was to make sure nobody else died from ignorance that could be cured with knowledge. Sarah's 4-year-old son, whose name was Tyler, and who had bright red hair and a gap in his front teeth, was staring at his mother with confusion that would break any parent's heart, not understanding why she was crying over his birthday cake, not understanding that the world had changed in ways his young mind couldn't process yet. Carlos approached them slowly, hands visible, voice calm, despite the chaos erupting around them, as other survivors fought over spoiled food like it was treasure instead of poison. He knelt down to Tyler's level first, a technique he'd learned from his own father about respecting children even in crisis, and said the words that would become his mantra over the coming weeks. "I can teach you something that will keep you safe." Sarah looked up with eyes that held the particular exhaustion of a parent trying to protect a child in circumstances beyond control, beyond reason, beyond anything suburban life had prepared her for, and Carlos saw in her face the same desperate hope he'd seen in his sister-in-law Maria's eyes right before Miguel died, that terrible bargaining with the universe that maybe this stranger knows something I don't. Maybe there's still a way to fix this. The first lesson Carlos taught them, right there in that sweltering supermarket aisle, with spoiled food dripping from breached packages and the smell of decay starting to permeate everything, was about temperature and bacterial growth, the invisible enemy that would kill more people in the first month than all the violence combined. He explained that food poisoning came in stages, that the dangerous bacteria started multiplying the moment refrigeration stopped, that even food that looked fine and smelled fine could harbor colonies of pathogens numerous enough to cause severe illness or death, that their senses weren't reliable guides in a world without laboratory testing or hospitals to save you when you guessed wrong. Tyler watched with wide eyes as Carlos pulled out a small notebook he'd been keeping, filled with temperatures and times and calculations that his logistics background made second nature, and drew simple diagrams showing how bacteria doubled and doubled again, how a single cell became millions, became billions in the span of hours. But knowledge without action was useless philosophy, so Carlos did something that would become his signature teaching method. He walked them through the supermarket, pointing out what to take and what to leave behind, creating an immediate practical lesson that could save their lives that very night. The canned goods were still safe, obviously, but Carlos taught them to check for bulging cans that indicated botulism, to avoid anything with dents or rust, to understand that even sealed containers could be compromised. The dried goods, pasta, rice, beans, flour, were treasure, assuming they were stored properly and hadn't been contaminated by water or rodents. The produce was more complicated, requiring knowledge of what spoiled fast and what lasted, and Carlos showed them how to inspect fruits and vegetables for signs of rot, how to understand that root vegetables stored cool and dark could last weeks, how to identify which items needed immediate preservation versus which ones gave them a few days to plan. Then came the difficult part, the lesson that would define survival for millions of people across the broken nation. Carlos taught them about salt preservation, the ancient technique that had allowed humanity to survive for millennia before refrigeration was ever invented. He led them to the baking aisle, where large containers of salt sat untouched, because most survivors were grabbing ready-to-eat food, not thinking about preservation, not planning beyond the next meal. Carlos explained the principle of salt curing, how salt drew moisture out of meat and created an environment where bacteria couldn't survive, how a concentration of salt above 20% would preserve protein almost indefinitely if done correctly. He walked them through the ratios, 3 parts salt to 1 part sugar for a basic cure, plus whatever spices you could find for flavor and additional antimicrobial properties, and explained that this knowledge, this simple chemical process, could transform pounds of meat that would rot in hours into preserved protein that could sustain them for months. Sarah was taking notes on the back of a receipt, her hands shaking but her focus absolute, the focus of a mother who would learn anything, do anything to keep her child alive. Carlos showed them how to identify meat that was still safe to cure, taught them the finger press test for determining freshness, explained that if it smelled even slightly off, you didn't risk it no matter how hungry you were. That food poisoning with no hospitals was a death sentence you couldn't bargain with. They found some pork chops in a cooler that had been packed with ice before the power died, meat that was still cool to the touch and still smelled clean. And Carlos demonstrated the curing process right there in the store, packing the chops in a thick layer of salt mixture, explaining that they needed to keep the cured meat cool and dry, that in the desert heat they'd need to find a basement or an underground space, that preservation was a constant battle against temperature and humidity and time. The smoke preservation lesson came next because Sarah mentioned she had a barbecue grill at home, and Carlos saw an opportunity to teach the complementary technique that would give them the most options. He explained cold smoking versus hot smoking, how cold smoke at temperatures between 68 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit would preserve meat by dehydrating it and coating it with antimicrobial compounds, how hot smoking at temperatures above 165 degrees would cook the meat while adding preservation properties, how combining salt curing with smoking created the most shelf-stable results. Carlos walked them to the spice aisle and showed them what to look for: peppercorns, coriander, bay leaves, explaining that these weren't just for flavor, but contained natural preservatives that inhibited bacterial growth and added another layer of protection against spoilage. Tyler was getting restless, and Carlos recognized the signs of a child reaching his limit, so he made the lesson interactive, giving the boy the job of carrying the salt containers while Carlos and Sarah gathered supplies. This served multiple purposes: keeping Tyler engaged, teaching him through participation, and modeling the community cooperation that would be essential for long-term survival. Carlos had learned in the military that people remembered what they did far more than what they heard, that hands-on learning created neural pathways that abstract instruction never could, that in crisis situations you needed knowledge embedded so deep it became instinct. As they worked their way through the supermarket, Carlos noticed other survivors watching them, some with suspicion, others with desperate curiosity. An older man named Robert, maybe 65, with silver hair and the weathered skin of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, approached and asked what Carlos was teaching. This moment became pivotal because Robert mentioned he'd been a fisherman in Alaska for 30 years and knew things about preserving salmon that Carlos had only read about in books. And suddenly, the teaching became a collaboration, two men pooling knowledge that together created something more valuable than either possessed alone. Robert explained the native Alaskan technique of wind-drying fish, how you could create semi-permeable membranes from the fish's own skin that allowed moisture to escape while protecting the meat from flies and contaminants, how the constant air movement in properly designed racks would dehydrate salmon to the point where it became shelf-stable for a year or more without refrigeration. This collaboration attracted more attention, and within an hour, Carlos and Robert had 12 people gathered around them, all taking notes, all asking questions, all hungry for knowledge that school had never taught them, and modern life had made irrelevant, until it suddenly became the most relevant thing in the world. There was Jamila, a 28-year-old pediatric nurse who understood infection control but not food preservation, whose medical knowledge would prove invaluable when combined with Carlos's survival training. There was Mr. Chen, a 73-year-old immigrant from Guangdong who spoke limited English but demonstrated pickling and fermentation techniques his grandmother had taught him 80 years ago in rural China, methods that predated refrigeration and would work perfectly in the New World. There was Marcus, a 19-year-old college dropout who'd been working at a hardware store and knew where to find the equipment they'd need: food-grade buckets, mesh screens, rope, tarps, all the infrastructure for large-scale preservation. The group that formed that day in the ruined supermarket became the nucleus of something larger, a survival collective that Carlos hadn't planned but recognized as essential. They made a decision collectively, democracy emerging naturally from shared crisis, that they would pool resources and knowledge, that they would set up a community preservation facility in the school gymnasium 3 blocks away that had a basement and good ventilation, that they would gather all the perishable food they could find before it rotted and preserve as much as possible before the window of opportunity closed forever. Carlos found himself leading not by authority, but by expertise, and he recognized the difference, understood that in this new world, nobody followed orders from rank or title, only from demonstrated ability to keep people alive. The walk to the school was 2 miles through streets that had transformed from suburban normalcy to chaotic refugee camp in just over 2 weeks. And Carlos saw in every block the evidence of how fast civilization unraveled when the infrastructure failed. Abandoned cars blocked intersections, some still containing bodies of people who died from dehydration or heat stroke or violence. Houses stood empty with doors hanging open, already looted by desperate neighbors who'd known these families for years before hunger overwrote social contracts. Groups of survivors had formed into tribal clusters, some helpful, others territorial, a few openly hostile to strangers passing through their claimed territory. Carlos kept the group moving, kept them focused on the mission, but his mind was cataloging every detail, every lesson about human behavior under catastrophic stress. Tyler was riding on Robert's shoulders now, the old fisherman having taken a grandfatherly interest in the boy, and Carlos felt a pang of loss thinking about his own father, who died 5 years before the collapse. Wondering what wisdom his father might have shared if he'd lived to see this world. His father had grown up poor in rural Mexico, had known hunger, had known what it meant to preserve food or starve, and Carlos wished desperately for one more conversation, one more chance to learn the techniques his father had considered too old-fashioned to pass down to American-born sons who he'd wanted to focus on education and escape the poverty he'd known. Now that old-fashioned knowledge was worth more than any college degree, and Carlos carried the guilt of lessons not learned when the teacher was still alive to share them. The school gymnasium basement was perfect. Concrete walls, good insulation, several small windows for ventilation, and most importantly, it was 10 degrees cooler than surface temperature. Carlos organized the group into teams based on their skills and knowledge. Jamila and two other volunteers would focus on medical preparation, understanding that food poisoning was inevitable and they needed treatment protocols even without pharmaceuticals. Mr. Chen and several others would set up fermentation stations for pickling vegetables and creating probiotic foods that would help maintain gut health when dietary variety disappeared. Robert and Marcus would build the smoking and drying racks using materials from the hardware store. Sarah and Tyler would organize the inventory system, tracking what they had and what they needed, creating the logistics framework that Carlos's military background told him was essential for any operation beyond subsistence level. Carlos himself took on the salt curing operation, the most critical and most dangerous if done incorrectly, because mistakes in preservation didn't show themselves immediately, but could kill weeks or months later when the preserved food went bad in ways that weren't visible until it was too late. He set up a station with tables, knives, cutting boards, and the massive quantities of salt they'd gathered, and began processing the meat they'd collected from multiple sources. Supermarkets, restaurants, homes, anywhere with freezers that had failed but might still contain food that hadn't fully spoiled yet. Each piece of meat got inspected with clinical precision, the smell test, the color check, the texture examination, because one piece of bad meat in the curing process could contaminate everything and sicken the entire community. The work was exhausting, physical labor in oppressive heat that had Carlos's shirt soaked with sweat within the first hour, but he found rhythm in it, meditation in the repetitive motions of trimming, salting, packing, stacking. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, while his mind processed the larger implications of what they were building. This wasn't just about preserving food for winter, though that was critical enough. This was about preserving knowledge, about creating a template that could be replicated across the city, across the region, creating nodes of survival expertise that could keep humanity alive long enough to rebuild something resembling civilization. Every person he taught became a teacher themselves. Exponential growth of knowledge that was humanity's only real advantage in a world that had suddenly become hostile to the species that had dominated it for so long. As the sun set on their first day of organized preservation work, Carlos stood in the basement, looking at the racks of salted meat, the jars of fermenting vegetables, the fish hanging in the drying stations, and felt something he hadn't felt since the collapse. Not hope exactly, because hope felt too fragile, but determination, purpose, the sense that maybe his survival wasn't just random chance, but an opportunity to make a difference that honored the memory of everyone who hadn't made it this far. Miguel's face flashed in his mind, his brother's final hours, the convulsions and the fever and the helplessness Carlos had felt watching him die from something as preventable as food poisoning, and he made a silent promise to his brother's memory that nobody else would die that way if Carlos could possibly prevent it. That knowledge would be his weapon against the chaos, that teaching would be his act of resistance against the entropy trying to consume everything. The community gathering that evening was impromptu, but felt necessary. People needing to connect, needing to share stories, needing to feel less alone in the ruins of their previous lives. They sat in a circle in the gymnasium above the basement. 23 people who'd been strangers 2 weeks ago, and Carlos listened as they talked about their losses, their fears, their small victories in staying alive. Jamila talked about the elderly woman she'd saved from dehydration by teaching her how to recognize the signs and find clean water sources. Marcus talked about his little sister, who was 14 and terrified, and who he was trying to keep innocent as long as possible, trying to shield her from the worst of what was happening in the streets. Mr. Chen spoke in halting English about his wife who died in the first week, heart attack brought on by stress, and how he was staying alive because she would have wanted him to use his knowledge to help people. Sarah shared Tyler's birthday cake story, how she'd been planning his party for months, how she'd bought that specific cake because it was his favorite, chocolate with vanilla frosting, how she'd watched it melt in the powerless store and realized in that moment that childhood as she'd known it, as her son was supposed to experience it, was gone forever and would never come back. She cried while she talked, ugly sobs that shook her shoulders, and Tyler climbed into her lap and hugged her with the fierce intensity only children can manage, and nobody rushed her. Nobody told her to be strong, because they all carried similar stories, similar moments when the old world died and the new one began, and grief needed space to exist even when survival demanded constant action. Carlos shared last, and he talked about Miguel, but also about the choice he'd made in that supermarket, the decision that teaching was his path forward, his way of processing the trauma and the guilt, and the overwhelming weight of staying alive when so many hadn't. He talked about his father's unused knowledge, about the generational gap that had seemed irrelevant before the collapse, but now felt like a tragic waste of wisdom that should have been passed down. He talked about his military training, about how logistics and supply chain management had seemed like boring desk work, but now was life-saving expertise, about how every experience in his life had been preparation for this moment, even though he'd never seen it coming. He talked about the responsibility of knowledge, how teaching someone a technique meant bearing some responsibility for their survival, how he couldn't save everyone, but he could try to save some, and that trying had to be enough because perfection was impossible and paralysis was death. When he finished speaking, Robert the fisherman said something that would become their community motto, the phrase that defined their collective purpose. We remember together what we've forgotten alone. It was simple but profound, capturing the idea that humanity's survival knowledge existed in fragments across millions of individual minds, that pooling that knowledge created something more powerful than any single person possessed. That community wasn't just about sharing resources, but about sharing understanding, creating a collective intelligence that multiplied rather than divided their chances of making it through winter. The next morning brought new challenges and new revelations about food preservation in a world without modern conveniences. Carlos discovered that one of the meat batches had started to smell wrong despite the salt cure, and after investigation realized that the temperature in one corner of the basement was too high, that heat from the kitchen above was conducting through the floor and creating a warm pocket where bacteria could survive. This led to a crash course in thermal management, teaching the group about insulation, air circulation, understanding that preservation wasn't just about technique, but about environment, that every space had microclimates that needed to be mapped and understood. They moved the curing racks away from the warm spot, used cardboard and scrap insulation to create barriers, set up a rotation system where they checked temperatures multiple times daily, turned preservation from a set-it-and-forget-it process into an active management challenge that required constant attention. Jamila brought another complication when she pointed out that several people in the community had developed diarrhea and stomach cramps, and Carlos felt his heart sink, wondering if they'd already failed, if contaminated food was spreading through the group despite their precautions. But Jamila's diagnostic skills identified the real culprit: too much salt in the diet too fast. People's bodies not adjusted to the massive sodium increase from eating cured meats, a metabolic shock that mimicked food poisoning but was actually just the human body struggling to process a radical dietary change. This led to another lesson about balance, about the need for variety even in survival situations, about understanding that optimal preservation and optimal nutrition weren't always the same thing, that they needed to preserve a mix of proteins, vegetables, fruits, anything that would provide micronutrients and fiber and metabolic balance. The fermentation station became critical for addressing this nutritional gap, and Mr. Zhen's knowledge of traditional Chinese pickling methods saved the community from scurvy and other deficiency diseases that were already appearing in other survivor groups across the city. He taught them about lactofermentation, the process where naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria converted sugars in vegetables into acid that both preserved the food and created probiotics that supported digestive health. The process was almost magical in its simplicity. Vegetables, salt, water, thyme, and resulted in food that was not only preserved, but actually more nutritious than the fresh versions. The fermentation creating B vitamins and enzymes that enhanced nutrient absorption. Carlos watched Mr. Chen demonstrate with cabbage, creating sauerkraut in 5-gallon buckets, explaining that in 3 weeks they'd have preserved vegetables that would last 6 months or more if kept cool and would provide the dietary balance they desperately needed. The community preservation project attracted attention from outside their immediate group, and Carlos found himself dealing with politics, with negotiations, with the messy reality that food was power and knowledge was leverage, and not everyone believed in the sharing economy model they'd adopted. A group led by a man named Derek, 40-something with military tattoos and an aggressive demeanor that Carlos recognized as fear masquerading as strength, demanded access to their preserved food stockpile, claimed that they'd been the ones to originally scout the supermarket, that they deserved a share of what the community had created. Carlos tried diplomacy first, offering to teach Derek's group the preservation techniques, suggesting they could set up their own operation and they'd all be stronger for having multiple preservation sites. But Derek didn't want knowledge, he wanted food. He wanted the immediate payoff without the work. The confrontation came to a head when Derek and 6 of his people tried to raid the gymnasium basement, breaking through the doors with crowbars and rushing the stairs before anyone could stop them. Carlos and Marcus and 3 others met them halfway, and for a terrible moment it looked like violence was inevitable, like blood would be spilled over food that wouldn't even keep people alive for more than a few weeks. But Robert did something unexpected. He stepped between the 2 groups and started talking, not yelling, just talking in his calm fisherman's voice about how stupid it was to fight over food when there was enough for everyone who was willing to work for it, about how Derek's people would eat their stolen food in a week and then they'd be back to starving while Carlos's community would be eating preserved food all winter, about how pride was going to kill more people than hunger if they didn't. Get smart fast. The words hung in the hot air of the stairwell, and Carlos saw Derek's certainty waver, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the recognition that maybe violence was the short-term solution, but learning was the long-term one. Derek lowered his crowbar, and the moment passed, and what could have been bloodshed became negotiation, became Derek's group agreeing to contribute labor in exchange for training, became an expansion of the community rather than a division of it. Carlos felt the tension drain from his muscles, but recognized that this was just the first of many such confrontations, that as winter approached and food became scarcer, they'd face this choice repeatedly: share or hoard, teach or gatekeep, build community or build walls. Integration of Derek's group brought new skills and new problems. Derek himself had been a butcher before the collapse, knew things about breaking down animal carcasses efficiently that Carlos's military training hadn't covered, could identify cuts and utilize parts of animals that others would have wasted. But Derek also had a daughter, 15 years old, named Emma, who was diabetic and whose insulin had run out 3 days before, and suddenly the community faced a medical crisis that food preservation couldn't solve. Jamila took over Emma's care, explaining that without insulin, they needed to manage her blood sugar through diet, that they needed to create meals that released glucose slowly, that they needed to monitor her constantly because diabetic ketoacidosis would kill her in days without proper medical intervention. This crisis sparked a broader conversation about medical needs in long-term survival, about the reality that chronic conditions that had been manageable with modern medicine were becoming death sentences in the collapse, about the need to expand their knowledge base beyond just food, to include medical preservation, herb medicine, improvised treatments for common conditions. Carlos found himself learning from Jamila, their expertise complementing each other, logistics and medicine merging into survival medicine, understanding that keeping people fed was only half the battle when injuries and illnesses could kill just as easily as starvation. The first snow came early that year, mid-October, when it should have been late November, and Carlos understood that the nuclear plant meltdowns in the aftermath of the EMP had altered the climate in ways that would make survival even harder than he'd calculated. The ash cloud from the fires, the particulates in the atmosphere, the disrupted weather patterns, all of it added up to a shorter growing season, a longer winter, conditions that would push human survival margins to their absolute limits. The community had maybe 2 months of preserved food at current consumption rates, and Carlos did the math, ran the calculations, and recognized that they needed to expand their operation exponentially or start rationing immediately. And rationing meant watching people slowly starve while knowing you had food you weren't sharing. He called a community meeting and laid out the numbers with brutal honesty, showed them the spreadsheet he'd been keeping, explained that wishful thinking wouldn't change mathematics, that they had 3 choices: find more food to preserve, reduce consumption, or expand the community to include more laborers who could increase production faster than they consumed resources. The discussion that followed was heated, emotional, full of fear and anger and desperation, but eventually consensus emerged around a plan to send out ranging teams, groups of 2 or 3 people who would scout the surrounding suburbs and countryside looking for any remaining food sources, abandoned farms, unlooted stores, wild game, anything that could be harvested and preserved before winter shut down their operations entirely. Carlos volunteered to lead the first ranging team, taking Marcus and a woman named Leah, who'd been a park ranger and knew wilderness survival, and they set out into the ruins of suburban Phoenix with empty backpacks and desperate hope that there was still food out there waiting to be found. The city was quieter now than it had been the first week. Most of the screaming and chaos settled into grim endurance, survivors either dead or organized into small groups focused on their own immediate survival. Carlos saw evidence everywhere of starvation taking hold, bodies lying in the streets unburied, abandoned homes with doors still locked where people had died quietly inside, groups of emaciated survivors too weak to even ask for help, just watching them pass with hollow eyes that haunted Carlos's dreams for weeks afterward. They found their first success in a suburban neighborhood that had been affluent enough to have expensive landscaping, fruit trees planted for decoration rather than production, and Leah identified citrus trees heavy with oranges and grapefruits that nobody had thought to harvest because people in modern suburbs saw landscaping as decoration, not food. They picked until their backpacks were full, and Leah taught them which wild plants were edible, pointing out prickly pear cactus that could be harvested for both fruit and pads, showing them how to identify mesquite trees whose pods could be ground into flour, explaining that the desert had always provided food for those who knew where to look and how to process it. This knowledge transformed Carlos's understanding of their situation. They weren't trapped in a food desert. They were surrounded by resources they didn't know how to utilize, and education was the key to unlocking abundance hidden in plain sight. The ranging became regular missions, different teams going out daily, mapping the area, cataloging resources, creating an atlas of survival knowledge that the community could use to sustain itself through the winter and beyond. They found a farm 10 miles out that had been abandoned, chickens running loose that could be captured and raised for eggs, a vegetable garden that had gone wild but still contained harvestable produce, a well that still worked and could provide clean water without the chemical treatment city water required. They found a food distribution warehouse that had been bypassed because it was industrial-scale packaging that most survivors couldn't process. But Carlos's group had the labor and knowledge to break down 50-pound bags of beans and rice into manageable portions, turning wholesale supplies into survival rations. Each success brought new challenges, new lessons about the complexity of survival at scale. The chickens needed feed, which meant they needed to find grain or grow it, which meant they needed to think about agriculture in addition to preservation. The warehouse food was infested with weevils and meal moths, which meant they needed to learn about pest control without chemicals, about freezing temperatures to kill insects, about proper storage containers that could protect food from contamination. Everything connected to everything else. And Carlos began to see survival not as a series of individual skills, but as a complex web of knowledge where every piece informed every other piece, where specialization was dangerous and generalization was necessary, where the only real expertise was understanding how all the systems fit together. By November, the community had swelled to 47 people, word spreading about the preservation project, survivors drawn to the promise of food and knowledge and organization in a world where most groups had descended into chaos or dictatorship. Carlos found himself in a leadership role he'd never sought, making decisions that affected dozens of lives, balancing needs against resources, trying to maintain democratic principles while acknowledging that survival sometimes required quick decisions that couldn't wait for consensus. He set up a council system, rotating leadership, ensuring that no single person held too much power, but that critical expertise was respected and utilized, creating a governance structure that could scale as the community grew. The first death after they'd organized the preservation project hit hard because it felt like failure, like all their efforts and knowledge hadn't been enough. Robert, the old fisherman who'd been so vital to their success, who'd mediated the conflict with Derek's group, who'd taught them so much about drying and smoking fish, collapsed while working on the preservation racks and never woke up. Jamila said it was probably his heart, stress and overwork and age combining in ways that no amount of food security could prevent. But Carlos felt the loss like a physical blow, grief mixing with guilt that maybe he'd pushed Robert too hard, asked too much from an elderly man who should have been taking it easy instead of working 12-hour days in the basement. They held a service, the community gathering to remember Robert's life, to honor his contribution, to acknowledge that survival didn't mean everyone survived, that death would come despite their best efforts, that the goal was to minimize loss, not eliminate it entirely. Tyler asked Carlos after the service why Robert had to die, 4-year-old logic trying to understand mortality in a world where death had become commonplace but was still incomprehensible to a child's mind. Carlos knelt down and spoke to him with complete honesty, something his own father had done with him, explaining that bodies wore out like machines, that sometimes people's hearts got tired, that Robert had lived a long life and had chosen to spend his final days helping other people survive, that this was a meaningful way to live, even if it meant his life ended sooner than it might have otherwise. Tyler seemed to understand in the way children do, accepting the explanation without needing to grasp all its implications, and then asked if Carlos would teach him how to preserve food like Robert had, if maybe he could help with the fish drying, even though he was small, if maybe Robert would have wanted someone to learn the techniques he'd taught so they wouldn't be forgotten when he died. That conversation changed something in Carlos, helped him see the preservation project not just as survival logistics, but as cultural continuity, as the passing down of knowledge from generation to generation, as the creation of traditions that would outlast any individual life. He began working with the children in the community, creating teaching sessions specifically for them, understanding that Tyler's generation would inherit this post-collapse world and needed to know these skills as second nature, the way Carlos's generation had known how to use smartphones and computers. The children learned eagerly, their minds more flexible than adults, their fears less paralyzing because they didn't carry the same memories of the world before, and Carlos saw in their enthusiasm a strange kind of hope, the possibility that humanity might not just survive but adapt, might create a new normal that incorporated both ancient knowledge and the resilience that crisis bred. Winter arrived in earnest in December, temperatures dropping to levels that the altered climate made unpredictable, snow falling in a desert that rarely saw it, survival becoming a test of preparation and adaptability. The community's preserved food stores proved adequate but not abundant, rationing necessary to stretch supplies until spring. And Carlos learned painful lessons about long-term planning, about the difference between surviving one season and surviving indefinitely, about the need to think in years, not weeks. They'd done enough to make it through winter, barely, but spring would require agriculture, animal husbandry, expansion of preservation infrastructure, solutions to problems they'd barely begun to consider. The hardest moment came in late January when Emma, Derek's diabetic daughter, developed an infection from a small cut that in the old world would have been treated with antibiotics and healed in days. But without antibiotics became sepsis, became systemic organ failure, became death despite everything Jamila tried. Derek held his daughter as she died, and Carlos stood with him, present but silent, because no words could make this loss bearable, no survival technique could fix what modern medicine had kept at bay, no amount of preserved food could change the fact that some medical conditions couldn't be managed with improvisation and hope. Derek broke afterward, spent 3 days locked in grief so profound that Carlos worried he'd die too. Just give up and stop eating and let death take him where it had taken Emma. But on the 4th day, Derek emerged and asked Carlos to teach him everything, every preservation technique, every survival skill, every piece of knowledge that might keep someone else's child alive, channeling his grief into purpose the way Carlos had done with Miguel's death. This bonding over shared loss created a friendship Carlos hadn't expected, Derek's aggression transformed by tragedy into focused determination, their combined knowledge creating new innovations in preservation and survival. Derek's butchering expertise combined with Carlos's logistics created more efficient meat processing, turning animal carcasses into usable protein with minimal waste. Derek understood bone marrow and organ meats and the nutritional value of parts that most people discarded, while Carlos understood how to preserve these components safely, how to render fat into stable cooking oils, how to create complete nutrition from entire animals rather than just the choice cuts. As winter began to ease and the days started getting longer, Carlos looked at the community they'd built and felt something beyond mere survival. He felt pride, felt accomplishment, felt that maybe losing Miguel and watching Robert die and failing to save Emma hadn't been meaningless suffering but transformation, catalyst that had forced him to become something more than he'd been before the collapse. The preservation project had evolved from emergency response to sustainable system, from desperate improvisation to carefully planned infrastructure that could support the community through seasons and years, from Carlos's individual knowledge to collective expertise that existed in dozens of minds and would survive even if he didn't. They held another community meeting in late February to plan for spring, discussing agriculture and water management and expansion of their operations. And Carlos listened more than he spoke, recognizing that his role had shifted from teacher to coordinator, that the community had absorbed his knowledge and was now generating its own innovations, its own solutions, its own path forward. Jamila proposed a medical garden for growing medicinal herbs that could address common ailments without pharmaceuticals. Marcus suggested a workshop for tool repair and creation, understanding that metal and woodworking would be essential skills as manufactured goods wore out. Mr. Chen wanted to establish an education program for the children, formal lessons in preservation and survival, and the knowledge that his generation carried but might not live long enough to fully pass down if they didn't create structured teaching. Sarah, Tyler's mother, had perhaps the most important insight when she said that they needed to document everything, to create written records of their techniques and knowledge, to understand that memory was fragile and people died and oral tradition could lose critical details, that survival knowledge needed to be preserved just as carefully as they preserved food, written down and protected and passed forward to people they would never meet, creating continuity across generations. This led to a documentation project where Carlos spent his evenings writing everything he knew about food preservation, creating a manual that combined his military logistics training with the traditional techniques they'd learned from Robert and Mr. Chen and others, adding drawings and diagrams and specific instructions that someone with no previous knowledge could follow, building a legacy that would outlast his own survival. The first day of spring brought both hope and uncertainty, warmth returning, but also the awareness that they'd barely survived winter, and the next one would come just as inevitably, that survival wasn't a destination, but a continuous process, that comfort and security were illusions they couldn't afford. But Carlos looked at the community gathered in the gymnasium, 47 people who'd been strangers and were now family, who'd learned and taught and worked together, who'd preserved not just food, but humanity's capacity for cooperation and mutual aid, even in catastrophic circumstances. And he felt that maybe this was enough. Maybe this small victory against the chaos was worth celebrating, even as they prepared for challenges ahead. The closing reflection came to him one evening as he stood in the basement surrounded by racks of preserved food, the physical manifestation of knowledge applied with care and discipline. And he thought about his brother Miguel, about his father's unshared wisdom, about Robert and Emma and all the others who hadn't made it, and he understood that their deaths weren't failures, but lessons, painful reminders that survival required both knowledge and luck, both skill and humility, both individual effort and collective support. He'd started this journey thinking he could teach his way through the apocalypse, that expertise alone would be sufficient. But he'd learned that teaching was just the beginning, that real survival meant building communities where knowledge flowed freely, where everyone contributed what they knew and learned what they didn't, where the goal wasn't individual heroism, but collective resilience. Carlos Mendez had lost his brother, lost people he'd tried to save, lost the world he'd known and any chance of returning to it, but he'd gained something too: purpose, community, the understanding that humans were most themselves, not when everything was easy, but when everything was hard. And they chose cooperation over competition, chose teaching over hoarding, chose to build rather than merely endure. The food stockpile that had rotted in those first terrible days had taught him that preservation wasn't just a technique, but a philosophy, a way of thinking about the future, a commitment to continuity in the face of disruption, an act of faith that tomorrow was worth planning for, even when today was barely survivable. And in that basement, surrounded by food that would last months because someone had taken the time to learn and teach and apply ancient knowledge to modern catastrophe, Carlos found something he hadn't expected in the ruins of civilization, meaning connection and hope stubborn enough to survive winter. The manual he'd been writing sat on a table near the preservation racks. Hundreds of pages of detailed instructions, drawings, calculations, lessons learned through trial and error, and sometimes tragedy. Knowledge distilled into transferable form that could help survivors he'd never meet, in places he'd never go, facing challenges he couldn't predict. Sarah had started making copies by hand, understanding that computers were gone and printing presses were useless, that human hands and careful penmanship were now the only way to replicate information, creating a small library of survival knowledge that the community guarded as carefully as they guarded their food stores, because both were essential to making it through winter and beyond. In the coming months, Carlos would travel, taking his knowledge to other survivor communities, teaching the preservation techniques that had kept his group alive, learning from others who discovered their own solutions to survival problems, creating networks of information exchange that spanned what was left of the American Southwest. He would watch some communities thrive and others collapse, would see his techniques save lives and also be misapplied by people who didn't fully understand the principles, would grapple with the reality that knowledge was power but also responsibility, that teaching someone something was creating a relationship that bound teacher and student in ways that casual instruction never could. But tonight, standing in the basement as winter finally released its grip on the desert, Carlos simply felt grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful to have found purpose in trauma, grateful to the people who taught him and the people he'd taught, grateful for the community that had coalesced around shared necessity and had become something more than survival, had become family chosen by circumstance, but cemented by choice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new knowledge to acquire and share. But tonight, there was food for 47 people for the next 4 months. There was warmth and shelter and the kind of tired satisfaction that comes from work that matters. And Carlos allowed himself to feel that this was enough. That survival measured in preserved food and shared knowledge and community resilience was victory against the chaos. Proof that humanity's real superpower wasn't technology, but the ability to learn, adapt, teach, and cooperate even when, especially when, everything else had fallen apart. He thought about Tyler, 4 years old now, but growing up in a world so different from the one his mother had imagined for him, learning food preservation techniques instead of multiplication tables, understanding survival instead of social media, and Carlos wondered what kind of adult that child would become, what kind of world his generation would build from the ruins the previous generation had left them. There was hope in that wondering, in the recognition that children were remarkably resilient, that Tyler still laughed despite everything, that the next generation might remember the collapse but wouldn't be defined by it, would grow up knowing how to preserve food and purify water and build shelter not as emergency skills, but as normal life, as the foundation of their reality, as the knowledge they would pass to their own children someday. The community had started planning a spring festival, a celebration of survival and an acknowledgement that they'd made it through winter. And Carlos had initially thought it was frivolous, resources wasted on celebration that should be conserved for necessities. But Jamila had convinced him that hope was a necessity, that humans needed rituals and joy and moments of communal acknowledgement, that they were still alive, still human, still capable of finding meaning and beauty in a world that had tried very hard to take both away. The festival would include music, such as it was with improvised instruments and remembered songs, and food, some of their precious preserved supplies cooked and shared in a communal meal, and stories, each person sharing what they'd learned, what they'd overcome, what they were grateful for despite everything. Carlos decided he would share Miguel's story at the festival, would talk about his brother's death from food poisoning and how that tragedy had sparked the preservation project that had kept so many others alive, would honor Miguel's memory by acknowledging that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most painful losses, that the people we couldn't save teach us how to save others, that grief and purpose aren't opposites, but companions, two aspects of love in a world that has proven fragile beyond anything humans had imagined in their comfortable assumptions about civilization's permanence. Standing in that basement, surrounded by the tangible evidence that knowledge could be transformed into survival, that teaching could be an act of resistance against entropy, that communities could form even from strangers when shared necessity became shared purpose. Carlos Mendez, 35-year-old former Army logistics officer, survival instructor, brother to a man who died too soon, student of his father's unshared wisdom, teacher to a community that had become family, felt the weight of everything that had happened since that Tuesday morning when the electromagnetic pulse had ended the world. And he chose gratitude over despair, chose purpose over paralysis, chose to keep teaching because teaching was how humans had survived every previous catastrophe and would survive this one too. One preserved meal, one shared technique, one student who became a teacher, one community at a time, building bridges from past knowledge to future survival across the chasm of collapse that separated what was from what could be. The manual sat waiting, pages filled with instructions that might save lives in communities he'd never visit, teaching people he'd never meet, creating ripples of knowledge that would spread outward through the ruins of civilization, like seeds scattered by wind, some finding fertile ground and taking root, growing into communities that would remember why they survived. Remembering that knowledge shared freely was the most valuable resource in a world where everything else had been taken away. And Carlos, looking at those pages, thinking about Miguel and Robert and Emma and everyone else who hadn't made it, thinking about Tyler and the children who would inherit this strange new world, thinking about the community upstairs preparing for spring and the challenges it would bring, thinking about all the lessons learned in blood and grief and stubborn hope, understood finally that his survival hadn't been meaningless chance, but opportunity, that staying alive meant taking responsibility. For keeping others alive, that knowledge without teaching was wisdom squandered, that the only real victory against catastrophe was measured not in individual survival, but in collective continuity, in the preservation of humanity's accumulated understanding passed forward across generations who would need it more desperately than any generation before. Where are you reading this from, and what time is it where you are right now? Your story matters just as much as Carlos's does, and I'd be honored if you'd share it in the comments below. Tell me about your own survival knowledge, the lessons your grandparents taught you that seemed old-fashioned until they weren't, the skills you've learned or want to learn, the communities you're building or want to build, because survival isn't just about food and water and shelter. It's about connection, about knowing that somewhere in this vast world, someone else is thinking about these same questions, facing similar fears, hoping for similar futures. Press that like button. If this story resonated with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next survivor's testimony. And remember that knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied, that every comment you leave teaches someone something, that we're all in this together even when we're scattered across the world, connected by stories and the stubborn human refusal to give up even when everything says we should. Thank you for listening to Carlos's story. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for choosing to learn, to care, to survive with purpose rather than just survive. Stay safe out there, wherever you are, whatever time you're reading this, and remember, your food stockpile will rot faster than you expect, but your knowledge, if shared, will last forever.